When Morgai, the high priest of the goddess Yonde, together with 12 of its most ferocious and efficient underlings, came at morning twilight to seek the infamous heretic Iban in his house of black gneiss on the headland above the northern main, they were surprised as well as disappointed to find him absent. Their surprise was due to the fact that they had every intention of taking him unawares, for all their plots against Iban had been carried on with meticulous privacy in underground vaults with sound-proof bolted doors, and they themselves had made the long journey to his house in a single night, immediately following the hour of his condemnation. They were disappointed because the formidable writ of arrest with symbolic flame-etched runes on a scroll of human skin was now useless, and because there seemed to be no early prospect of trying out the indigenous agonies, the intricately harrowing ordeals which they had devised for Iban with such care. Morgai was especially disappointed, and the malison which he muttered when the emptiness of the topmost room had revealed itself were of truly cabalistic length and fearfulness. Iban was his chief rival in wizardry, and was acquiring altogether too much fame and prestige among the peoples of New Sulan, that ultimate peninsula of Hyperborean continent. So Morgai had been glad to believe certain malignant rumors concerning Iban and to utilize them in the charges he had preferred. These rumors were that Iban was a devotee of the long discredited heathen god Thaqua, whose worship was incalculably older than that of a man, and that Iban's magic was drawn from his unlawful affiliation with this dark deity, who had come down by way of other worlds from a foreign universe in primeval times when the earth was still no more than a steaming morass. The power of Thaqua was still feared, and it was said that those who were willing to forego their humanity by serving him would become the heritors of antemundane secrets and the masters of a knowledge so awful that it could only have been brought from outlying planets to coeval with night and chaos. The house of Iban was built in the form of a pentagonal tower and possessed 5 stories, including the 2 that were underground. All, of course, had been searched with painstaking thoroughness, and with 3 servants of Iban had been tortured with a slow drip of boiling hot asphaltum to make them reveal their master's whereabouts. Continued denial of all knowledge after half an hour of this was taken as proof that they were genuinely ignorant. No sign of subterranean passage was unearthed by delving in the walls and the floor of the lower rooms, though Morgai had even gone so far as to remove the flagstones beneath an obscene image of Thaqua, which occupied the nethermost. This he had done with extreme reluctance, for the squat, fur-covered god, with his bat-like features and sloth-like body, was fearsomely abhorrent to the high priest of the elk goddess Yunde. Rounding in renewed search to the highest room of Iban's tower, the inquisitors were compelled to own themselves baffled. There was nothing to be found but a few articles of furniture, some antique volumes on conjuration such as might be owned by any sorcerer, some disagreeable and gruesome paintings on rolls of petrodactyl parchment, and certain primitive urns and sculptures and totem poles of the sorts that Iban had been so fond of collecting. So Thaqua, in one form or another, was represented in most of these, his face even leered with bestial somnolence from the urn handles, and he was to be found in half the totems, which were those of subhuman tribes, along with the seal, the mammoth, the giant tiger, and the aurochs. Mordjai felt that the charges against Iban were now substantiated beyond all remaining doubt, for surely no one who was not a worshipper of Thaqua would care to own even a single representation of this loathsome entity. However, such additional evidence of guilt, no matter how significant or damnatory, was of small help in finding Iban, staring from the windows of the topmost chambers, where the walls fell sheer to the cliff-sea floor, 100 feet below. Mordjai was driven to credit his rival with the superior resources of magic. Otherwise, the man's disappearance was altogether too much of a mystery. And Mordjai had no love for mysteries unless they were part of his own stock in trade. He turned from the window and re-examined the room with minutely careful attention. Iban had manifestly used it as a sort of study. There was a writing table of ivory with reed pens and various colored inks in little earthen pots, and there were sheets of paper made from a kind of calamite, all scribbled over with odd astronomical and astrological calculations that caused Mordjai to frown because he could not understand them. On each of the 5 walls there hung one of the parchment paintings. All of which seemed to be the work of some aboriginal race. Their themes were blasphemous and repellent, and so Thaqua figured in all of them, amid forms and landscapes whose abnormality and sheer uncouthness may have been due to the half-developed technique of the primitive artists. Mordjai now tore them from the walls one by one, as if he suspected that Iban might in some manner be concealed behind them. The walls were now entirely bare, and Mordjai considered them for a long time, amid the respectful silence of his underlings. A queer panel high up in the southeastern side above the writing table had been revealed by the removal of one of the paintings. Mordjai's heavy brows met in a long black bar as he eyed this panel. It was conspicuously different from the rest of the wall, being an oval-shaped inlay of some reddish metal that was neither gold nor copper, a metal that displayed an obscure and fleeting fluorescence of rare colors when one peered at it through half-shut eyelids. But somehow it was impossible with open eyes even to remember the colors of this fluorescence. Mordjai, who perhaps was cleverer and more perspicacious than Iban had given him credit for being, conceived a suspicion that was apparently baseless and absurd, since the wall contained the panel was the outer wall of the building and could give only on the sky and sea. He climbed upon the writing table and struck the panel with his fist. The sensations which he felt and the result of the blow were alike astounding. A sense of icy cold so extreme that it was hardly distinguishable from extreme heat ran along his hand and arm through his whole body as he smote the unknown reddish metal. And the panel itself swung easily outward as if on unseen hinges, with a high sonorous clang that seemed to fall from an incomputable distance. Beyond it Mordjai saw that there was neither sky nor sea, nor in fact anything he had ever seen or heard, or even dreamed of in his most outrageous nightmares. He turned to his companions. The look on his face was half amazement, half triumph. "Wait here till I return," he commanded, and leaped headlong through the open panel. The charges that had been brought against Iban were indeed true. The sagacious wizard, in his lifelong study of laws and agencies, both natural and supernatural, had taken account of the myths that were prevalent in Muthulan regarding Sothaqua, and had brought it conceivably worthwhile to make a personal investigation of this obscure pre-human entity. He had cultivated the acquaintance of Sothaqua, who in the destitute of his worship was now driven to lead an existence wholly subterranean. He had offered the prescribed prayers, had made the sacrifices that were most acceptable, and the strange, sleepy little god, in return for Iban's interest and his devotion, had confined to him certain information that was more than useful in the practice of the black arts. Also, he had presented Iban with some autobiographical data that had confirmed the popular legends in a more explicit detail. For reasons which he did not specify, he had come to Earth in former eons from the planet Synchranash, namely by which Saturn was called in Muthulan, and Synchranash itself had been merely a way station in his travels from remoter worlds and systems. As a special reward after years of service and burned offerings, he presented to Ivan a large, thin oval plate of some ultra-telluric metal, instructing him to have it fitted as a hinged panel in an upper room of his house. The panel, if swung outward from the wall on open air, would have the peculiar property of giving admittance to the world of Synchranosh, many millions miles away in space. According to the vague and somewhat unsatisfactory explanation vouchsafed by the god, this panel partly wrought from a kind of matter which belonged to another universe than man's, possessed uncommon radiative properties that served to ally it with some higher dimension of space, through which the distance to astronomically remote spheres was a mere step. Sothaqua, however, warned Iban to not make use of the panel unless in time of extreme need, as a means of escape from otherwise inevitable danger, for it would be difficult, if not impossible, to return to Earth from Synchranosh, a world where Iban might find it, if anything, but easy to acclimate himself. since the conditions of life were different from those in Mu-Thulan, even though they did not involve so total an inversion of all terrene standards and norms as that which prevailed in the more outlying planets. Some of Thakwa's relatives were still resident in Sikranosh and were worshipped by its peoples, and so Thakwa told Iban the almost unpronounceable name of the most powerful of these deities, saying that it would be useful to him as a sort of password if he should ever need to visit Sikranash. The idea of a panel that would open on some remote world impressed Iban as being rather fantastic, not to say far-fetched, but he had found Thakwa to be in all ways and at all times a most veracious deity. However, he made no trial of the panel's unique virtues, as Thakwa, who maintained a close surveillance of all underground doings, had warned him of the machinations of Mordjai and the processes of ecclesiastic law that were being instituted in the vaults below the temple of Yunde. Knowing as he did the power of these jealous bigots, Iban decided that it would be injudicious to the point of folly if he were to let himself fall into their hands. Bidding a short and grateful farewell to Thakwa and collecting a small parcel of bread and meat and wine, he retired to his study and climbed upon the writing table. Then, putting aside the crude picture of a scene in Sikranash, with which Thakwa had inspired some primeval half-human artist, he pushed open the panel it had served to conceal. Iban saw that Thakwa was indeed a god of his world, for the scene beyond the panel was nothing that could ever find a legitimate place in the topography of Mu-Thulan, or of any terrestrial region. It did not altogether appeal to him, but there was no alternative save the inquisitorial cells of the goddess Yunde, envisaging in thought the various refinements and complications of torture which Mordjai would have now prepared. He sprang through the opening into Sikranash with an agility that was quite juvenile for a wizard of mature years. It was only a step, but turning he saw that all the trace of the panel of his dwelling had now disappeared. He was standing on a long declining declivity of ashen soil, down with a sluggish stream that was not water, but some liquescent metal resembling mercury ran from tremendous unscalable shoulders and horns of the mountain heights above to debouch in a hill-surrounded lake of the same liquid. The slope beneath him was lined with rows of peculiar objects, and he could not make up his mind whether they were trees, mineral forms, or animal organisms, since they appeared to combine certain characteristics of all of these. The preternatural landscape was appallingly distinct in every detail, under a greenish-black sky that was overarched from end to end with a triple cyclopean ring of dazzling luminosity. The air was cold, and Iban did not care for its sulphurescent color, or the odd puckery sensation it left in his nostril and lungs. And when he took a few steps on the unattractive-looking soil, he found that it had the disconcerting friability of ashes that have dried once more after being wetted with rain. He started down the slope, half fearing that some of the equivocal objects around him would reach out to their mineral boughs or arms to arrest his progress. They seemed to be a kind of bluish-purple obsidian cacti, with limbs that ended in formidable taeon-like spines and heads that were altogether too elaborate for either fruits or blossoms. They did not move as he passed among them, but he heard a faint and singular tinkling with many modulations of tone that preceded and followed him along the slope. Iban conceived the uncomfortable notion that they were holding converse with each other and were perhaps debating what should be done with him or about him. However, he reached without mishap or hindrance the end of the declivity, where terraces and ledges of decomposing trap, like a mighty stairway of elder eons, had rimmed the sunken lake of liquescent metal. Wondering as to the way he should now take, Ivan stood irresolute on one of the ledges. His train of conjecture was broken by a shadow that fell suddenly athwart him and lay like a monstrous blot on the crumbling stone at his feet. He was not prepossessed by the shadow. It was outrageously defiant of all known aesthetic standards, and its malformation and distortion were no less than extravagant. He turned to see what manner of creature had flung the shadow. This being he perceived was not easy to classify, with its ludicrously short legs, its exceedingly elongated arms, and its round, sleepy-looking head that was pendulous from a spherical body, as it were turning a somnambulistic somersault. But after he had studied it a while, and had noted its furriness and somnolent expression, he began to see a vague though inverted likeness to the god Sothakwa, and remembering how Sothakwa had said the form assumed by himself on earth was not altogether that which he had worn in Sikranaj, Iban now wondered if this entity was one of Sothakwa's relatives. He was trying to recall the almost inarticulable name that he had been confided to by the god as a sort of password, when the owner of that unusual shadow, without seeming to note Iban's presence, began a descent of the terraces and ledges towards the lake. Its locomotion was mainly on its hands, for the absurd legs were not half long enough for the steps it had to take. Arriving at the lake edge, the creature drank of the liquid metal in hearty and copious matter that served to convince Iban of its godship, for surely no being of an inferior biologic order would quench its thirst with a beverage so extraordinary. Then reascending to the ledge where Iban stood, it paused and appeared to notice him for the first time. Iban had finally remembered the outlandish name for which he was groping. Hazul Kungnim Mazah, he sought to articulate. Doubtless the result was not wholly conformable to Sycranosian rules, but Iban did the best he could with his vocal organs at his command. His auditor seemed to recognize the word, for it peered at Iban a little less sleepily than before, with its inversely situated eyes, and even deigned to utter something which sounded like an attempt to correct his pronunciation. Iban wondered how he was ever to learn such a language, or having learned it, how he was ever to pronounce it. However, it heartened him a little to find that he was understood at all. So Thaqua, he said, repeating the name 3 times in his most orotund, incantatory manner. The topsy-turvy being opened its eyes a trifle more, and again admonished him, uttering the word Sothaqua with an indescribable abbreviation of vowels and thickening of consonants. Then it stood regarding him for a while, as if in doubt of or cogitation. Finally it raised one of its long arms from the ground and pointed along the shore, where the mouth of a low valley was discernible above the hills. It said distinctly the enigmatic word Ikul diarsh od long, and then, while the sorcerer was pondering the significance of this unusual locution, it turned away from him and started to reascend the higher steps toward a rather spacious cavern, with columned opening that he had not hitherto perceived. It had hardly passed from sight into the cavern when Iban was greeted by the high priest Mordjai, who had readily followed him by his tracks in the ashen soil. "Detestable sorcerer, abominable heretic, I arrest you," said Mordjai with pontifical severity. Iban was surprised, not to say startled, but it reassured him to see that Mordjai was alone. He drew the sword of highly tempered bronze which he carried and smiled. "I should advise you to moderate your language, Mordjai," he admonished. "Also, your idea of arresting me is slightly out of place now, since we're alone together in Sikranaj, and Musulan and the temple cells of Yunde are many million miles away." Mordjai did not appear to relish this information. He scowled and muttered, "I suppose this is some more of your damnable wizardry." Iban chose to ignore the insinuation. "I have been conversing with one of the gods of Zikranash," he said, magniloquently. "The god whose name is Huzul Quagmenazah has given me a mission to perform, a message to deliver, and has indicated the direction in which I should go. I suggest that you lay aside your little mundane disagreement and accompany me. Of course, we could still slit each other's throats or eviscerate each other, since we are both armed, but under the circumstances, I think you will see the puerility, not to mention the sheer inutility of such a proceeding. If we both live, we may be of mutual use and assistance in a strange world whose problems and difficulties, if I mistake not, are worthy of our united powers." Mordjai frowned and pondered. "Very well," he said grudgingly, "I consent, but I warn you that matters will have to take their course when we return to Musulan." "That," rejoined Iban, "is a contingency which need not trouble either of us. Shall we start?" The two Hyperboreans had been following a defile that wound away from the lake of fluid metal among hills whose vegetation thickened and grew more various as their height decreased. It was the valley that had been indicated to the sorcerer by the topsy-turved biped Morgwai, A natural inquisitor in all senses was plying Iban with questions. Who or what was the singular entity that disappeared in a cavern just before I accosted you? That was the god Isul Koigeminsa. And who, pray, is that for this god? I confess that I have never heard of him. He is the paternal uncle of Sothakwa. Mordjai was silent except for a queer sound that might have been either an interrupted sneeze or an exclamation of disgust, but after a while he asked, "And what is this mission of yours?" "That will be revealed in due time," answered Iban, with a sententious dignity. "I am not allowed to discuss it at present. I have a message from the god which I must deliver only to the proper person." Mordjai was unwillingly impressed. "Well, I suppose you know what you're doing and where you're going." "Can you give me any hint as to your destination?" "That too will be revealed in due time." The hills were lapsing gently to a well-wooded plain whose flora would have been the despair of earthly botanists. Beyond the last hill, Iban and Mordjai came to a narrow road that began abruptly and stretched away in the distance. Iban took the road without hesitation. Indeed, there was little else to do, for the thickets of mineral plants and trees were rapidly becoming impenetrable. They lined the way with serrate branches that were like sheaves of darts and daggers, or of sword blades and needles. Iban and Mordjai soon noticed that the road was full of large footprints, all of them circular in form and rimmed about with the marks of protruding claws. However, they did not communicate their misgivings to each other. After an hour or two of progress along the yielding ashy thoroughfare, amid the vegetation that was more horrent than ever with knives and caltrops, the travelers began to remember that they were hungry. Mordjai, in his haste to arrest Iban, had not breakfasted, and Iban, in his natural hurry to evade Mordjai, had committed a like omission. They halted by the wayside, and the sorcerer shared his parcel of food and wine with the priest. They ate and drank with frugality. However, since the supply was limited and the landscape about them was not likely to yield any viands that were suitable for human sustenance, with strength and courage revived by this little refection, they continued their journey. They had not gone far when they overtook a remarkable monster that was plainly the originator of the numerous footprints. It was squatting down with its armored haunches towards the travelers, filling the whole road for an indeterminable distance ahead. They could see that it was possessed of a myriad of short legs, but they could form no idea of what its head and forequarters were like. Iban and Mordjai were much dismayed. "Is this another of your gods?" asked Mordjai ironically. The sorcerer did not reply, but he realized that he had a reputation to sustain. He went boldly forward and cried out, "Hasul Quao Minsha," in the most resonant bellow that he could summon. At the same time he drew his sword and thrust it between two plates of the horny mail that covered the monster's hindquarters. Greatly to his relief, the animal began to move and resumed its march along the road. The Hyperboreans followed it, and whenever the creature slackened its pace, Iban would repeat the formula which he had found so effective. Mordjai was compelled to regard him with a certain awe. They travelled on in this manner for several hours. The great luminous triple ring still overarched the zenith, but a strangely small and chilly sun had now intersected the ring and was declining toward the west of Sikranaj. The forest along the way was still a high wall of sharp metallic foliage, but other roads and paths and byways were now branching off from one that the monster followed. All was very silent except for the many-footed shuffling of his uncouth animal, and neither Iban nor Mordjai had spoken for miles. The high priest was regretting more and more his rashness in pursuing Iban through the panel, and Iban was wishing that so Thaqua had given him the entree to a different sort of world. They were startled out of their meditations by a sudden clamor of deep and booming voices that rose from somewhere in advance of the monster. It was a veritable pandemonium of unhuman guttural bellowings and croakings, with notes that were somehow suggestive of reproof and abjuration, like shrewish drums, as if the monster were being scolded by a group of unimaginable entities. "Well," queried Mordjai, "all that we are destined to behold will reveal itself at the proper time," said Ivan. The forest was thinning rapidly, and the clamor of termagant bellows was drawing closer, still following the hind quarters of their multi-pedaled guide, which was crawling on with reluctant slowness. The travelers emerged in an open space and beheld a most singular tableau. The monster, which was plainly of a tame and harmless and stupid sort, was covering before a knot of beings no larger than men, who were armed only with long-handed goads. These beings, though they were bipeds, and were not quite so unheard of in their anatomic structure as the entity which Iban had met by the lake, were nevertheless sufficiently unusual, for their head and bodies were apparently combined in one, and their ears, eyes, nostril bouts, and certain other organs of doubtful use were all arranged in a somewhat unconventional grouping on their chests and abdomens. They were wholly naked and were rather dark in color, with no trace of hair on any part of their bodies. Behind them, a little distance away, were many edifices of a kind which hardly conformed to humans' ideas of architectural symmetry. Iban strode valorously forward, with Mordjai following discreetly. The torso-headed beings ceased their scolding of the fawning monster, and peered at the earthmen with expressions that were difficult to read on account of the odd and baffling relationship of their features. "Hasul kulmen so Thaqua," said Iban with oracular solemnity and sonority. Then, after a pause of a hierarchic length, "Ikul dayash od lonk." The result was indeed gratifying, and that was all that could be expected even from a formula so remarkable, for the Sikranosian beings dropped their goads and bowed before the sorcerer, till their featured bosoms almost touched the ground. I have performed the mission. I have delivered the message given me by Hasselkummingsa, said Iban to Mordjai. For several Synchronosian months, the two Hyperboreans were honored guests of the quaint and worthy and virtuous people who called themselves the Blemfs. Iban had a real gift for languages and made progress in the local tongue far more readily than Mordjai. His knowledge of the customs, manners, ideas, and beliefs of the Blemfs soon became extensive, but he found it a source of disillusionment as well as of illumination. The armored monster that he and Mordjai had driven before them so valiantly was, he learned, a domestic beast of burden that had strayed away from its owners amid the mineral vegetation of the desert lands adjoining Velor, the chief town of Blemfs. The genuflections with which Iban and Mordjai had been greeted were only an expression of gratitude for the safe return of this beast, and were not, as Iban had thought, an acknowledgment of the divine names he had quoted and the fearsome phrase Ikoi de Losh Odlonk. The being that Iban had met by the lake was indeed the god Husulkoigmensa, and there were dim traditions of Sothakwa in certain early myths of the Befilfroims. But these people, it seemed, were most regrettably materialistic and had long ceased to offer sacrifice and prayer to the gods, though they spoke of them with a sort of distant respect and with no actual blasphemy. Iban learned that the words Ikui, Dilash, Odlonk doubtless belonged to a private language of the gods, with which the Befilfroims no longer understood, but which, however, was still studied by a neighboring people, the Edems, who maintained the ancient formal worship of Husulkoigmensa and various related deities. The Blemfs were indeed a practical race and had few, if any, interests beyond the cultivation of a great variety of edible fungi, of the breeding of large centipedal animals, and the propagation of their own species. The latter process, as revealed to Iban and Mordjai, was somewhat unusual. Though the Blemfs were bisexual, only one female in a generation was chosen for reproductive duties. And this female, after growing to mammoth size on food prepared from a special fungus, became the mother of an entire new generation. When they had been well initiated into the life and customs of Velor, the Hyperboreans were privileged to see the future national mother called Genkum, who had attained the requisite proportions after years of scientific nourishment. She lived in an edifice that was necessarily larger than any of the other buildings on Velor, and her sole activity was the consumption of immense quantities of food. The sorcerer and the inquisitor were impressed, even if not captivated, by the mountainous aptitude of their charms and by their highly novel arrangement. They were told that the male parent or parents of the forthcoming generation had not yet been selected. The possession of separate heads by the Hyperboreans seemed to lend them a remarkable biologic interest in the eyes of their host. The Blemfs it was learned, had not always been headless, but had reached their present physical conformation through a slow process of evolution in which the head of the archetypal Blemfs had been merged by imperceptible degree with the torso. But unlike most peoples, they did not regard their current stage of development with unqualified complacency. Indeed, their headlessness was a source of national regret. They deplored the re-entrenchment of nature in this regard, and the arrival of Iban and Mordjai, who were looked upon as ideal exemplars of cephalic evolution, had served to quicken their eugenic sorrow. The sorcerer and the inquisitor, on their part, found life rather dull among the Blemfs after the first feeling of exotism had worn off. The diet was tiresome for one thing, an endless succession of raw and boiled and roasted mushrooms, varied at rare intervals by the coarse and flabby meat of the tame monsters. And this people, though they were always polite and respectful, did not seem to be greatly awed by the exhibitions of Hyperborean magic with which Iban and Mordjai favored them. And their lamentable want of religious ardor made all evangelistic endeavor a thankless task. And being fundamentally unimaginative, they were not even duly impressed by the fact that their visitors had come from a remote, ultra-Sychronosian world. "I feel," said Iban to Mordjai one day, "that the god was sadly mistaken in deigning to send this people a message of any sort." It was very soon after this that a large committee of Blemfs waited upon Iban and Mordjai and informed them that after long consideration they had been selected as the fathers of the next generation and were to be married forthwith to the tribal mother in the hope that a well-headed race of Blemfs would result from the union. Iban and Mordjai were quite overcome by the proposed eugenic horror, thinking of the mountainous female they had seen. Mordjai was prone to remember his sacerdotal vows of celibacy, and Iban was eager to take similar vows upon himself without delay. The inquisitor, indeed, was so overwhelmed as to be rendered almost speechless, but with a rare presence of mind the sorcerer temporized by making a few queries anent the legal and social status which would be enjoyed by Mordjai and himself as the husbands of Jenkum. And the native, naive Blemfs told him that this would be a matter of brief concern, that after completing their marital duties, the husbands were always served to the national mother in the form of ragouts and other culinary preparations. The Hyperboreans tried to conceal from their host the reluctance with which they both regarded the coming honor in all its stages. Being as usual a master of diplomatics, Iban went so far as to make a formal acceptance on behalf of himself and his companion. But when the delegation of Blemfs had departed, he said to Mordjai, "I am more than ever convinced that the god was mistaken. We must leave the city of Velor with all feasible dispatch, and continue our journey till we find a people who are worthier to receive his communication." Apparently it had never occurred to the simple and patriotic Blemfs that fathering of the next national litter was a privilege that anyone would dream of rejecting. Iban and Mordecai were subjected to no manner of duress or constraint, and their movements were not even watched. It was an easy matter to leave the house in which they had been domiciled when the rumbling snores of their host were assembling and ascending to the great ring of Sycranosian moons, and to follow the highway that led from Belor toward the country of Edems. The road before them was well marked, and the ring light was almost as clear as brilliant as a full day. They traveled a long distance through the diversified and always unique scenery which it served to illumine before the rising of the sun and the consequent discovery of their departure by the Blemfs, these single-minded bipeds, it is likely were too sorely perplexed and dumbfounded by the loss of their guests, whom they had chosen as future progenitors, to even think of following them. The land of Edems, as indicated on an earlier occasion by Blemfs, was many leagues away, and tracts of ashen deserts, of mineral cacti, of fungoid deserts, and high mountains intervened. The boundary of the Blemfs, marked by a crude, sculpturesque representation of the tribal mother beside the way, was passed by the travelers before dawn, and during the following day they journeyed among more than one of those unusual races who so diversify so widely the population of Saturn. They saw gibbes, that Apterous and Stygian bird people who roost on their individual Dolomites for years at a time, and meditate upon the cosmos, uttering to each other at long intervals the mystic syllables yop, yeep, yoop, which are said to express an unfathomed range of esoteric thought. And they met those flibbertigibbet pygmies, the Ephics, who hollow out their homes in the trunks of certain large fungi, and are always having to hunt new habitations because the old ones crumble into powder in a few days. And they heard the underground croaking of that mysterious people, the Galongs, who dread not only the sunlight, but also the ring light, and who have never yet been seen by any of the surface dwellers. By sunset, however, Iban and Mordecai had crossed the domains of all the aforementioned races, and had even climbed the lower scarps of those mountains which still divided them from the land of Edems. Here, on a sheltered ledge, their weariness impelled them to halt, and since they had now ceased to dread pursuit from the Blemfs, they wrapped themselves more tightly in their mantles against the cold after a meagre supper of raw mushrooms, and fell asleep. Their slumber was disturbed by a series of cacodemoniacal dreams, in which they both thought they had been recaptured by the Blemfs and were forced to espouse the Gencombe. They awoke shortly before dawn from visions whose details were excruciatingly vivid, and were more than ready to resume their ascent of the mountains. The slopes and cliffs above them were desolate enough to have deterred any travelers of inferior hardihood or less cogent fears. The tall woods of fungi dwindled ere long to tiny growths, and soon lessened to forms that were no bigger than lichens. And after this there was nothing but black and naked stone. The wiry and slender Iban suffered no great inconvenience from the climb, but Mordjai, with his sacerdotal girth and bulk, was soon winded. Whenever he paused to recover his breath, Iban would say to him, "Think of the national mother," and Mordjai would climb the next acclivity like an agile but somewhat asthmatic mountain sheep. They came at noon to a pinnacle-guarded pass from which they could look down on the country of the Edems. They saw that it was a broad and fertile realm, with woods of mammoth mushrooms and other thallophytes that excelled in size and number those of any other region they had yet traversed. Even the mountain slopes were more fruitful on this side, for Iban and Mordjai had not descended far when they entered a grove of enormous puffballs and toadstools. They were admiring the magnitude and variety of these growths when they heard a thunderous noise on the mountain above them. The noise drew nearer, gathering to itself the roar of new thunders. Iban would have prayed to Sothakwa, and Mordjai would have supplicated the goddess Yunde, but unfortunately there was no time. They were caught in a mighty mass of rolling puffballs and toppling toadstools, overthrown by the huge avalanche that had started on the heights above, and borne with increasing momentum, with vertiginous speed and tumult amid an ever-growing heap of shattered fungi. They finished their descent of the mountain in less than a minute. Endeavoring to extricate themselves from the pile of thallophytic debris which they were buried, Iban and Mordjai noticed that there still seemed to be a good deal of noise, even though the avalanche had stopped. Also, there were other movements and heavings than their own in the pile. When they had managed to get their necks and shoulders clear, they discovered that the commotion was being made by a certain people who differed from their late host, the Blemfs, in that they possessed rudimentary heads. These people were some of the Edems, one of whose towns the avalanche had descended. Roofs and towers were beginning to emerge from the mass of boulders and puffballs, and just in front of them, the Hyperboreans, there was a large temple-like edifice from whose blocked-up doors a multitude of the Edems had now tunneled their way. At sight of Iban and Mordjai, they suspended their labors, and the sorcerer, who had freed himself and had made sure that all his bones and members were intact, now took the opportunity to address them. "Hearken," he said with great importance. "I have come to bring you a message from the god Hesulkoigminsa. I have borne it faithfully on ways beset with many hazards and perils. In the god's own divine language it runs thus: Iqui de losh od funk. Since he spoke in the dialect of the Blemfs, which differed somewhat from their own, it's doubtful if the Edems altogether understood the first part of his utterance. But Hesulkoigminsa was their tutelary deity, and they knew the language of the gods, and the words Iqui de losh od glunk, there was a most remarkable resumption and increase of activity, a ceaseless running to and fro on the part of the Edems, a shouting of guttural orders, and a recrudescence of new heads and limbs from the avalanche. Those who had issued from the temple re-entered it and came out once more, carrying a huge image of a Hisul Kogminsa, some smaller icons of lesser though allied deities, and a very ancient-looking idol, which both Iban and Mordjai recognized as having a resemblance to Sothakwa. Others of the Edems brought their household goods and furniture forth from the dwellings, and signing the Hyperboreans to accompany them, the whole populace began to evacuate the town. Iban and Mordjai were mystified, and it was not until a new town had been built on the fungus-wooded plain, at the distance of a full day's march, and they themselves had been installed among the priests of the new temple, that they learned the reason of it all, and the meaning of Ikoi, the Lash od Clunk. These words meant merely, "Be on your way," and the god had addressed them to Iban as a dismissal. But the coincidental coming of the avalanche and of Iban and Mordjai with this purported message from the god had been taken by the Edems as a divine injunction to remove themselves and their goods from their present location. Thus the wholesale exodus of people with their idols and domestic belongings. The new town was called Blemfs, and the other the avalanche had buried. Here, for the remainder of their days, Iban and Mordjai were held in much honor, and their coming with the message Ikul the Lash od Clunk was deemed a fortunate thing, since there were no more avalanches to threaten the security of Glumf in its new situation remote from the mountains. The Hyperboreans shared the increment of civic affluence and well-being resultant from this security. There was no national mother among the Edems who propagated themselves in a far more general manner than the Blemfs, so existence was quite safe and tranquil. Iban, at least, was really in his element, for the news which he brought of Sothakwa, who was still worshipped in this region of Sikranaj, had enabled him to set up a sort of minor prophet, even apart from the renown which he enjoyed as the bearer of the divine message and as the founder of the new town of Glumf. Mordjai, however, was not entirely happy. Though the Edems were religious, they did not carry their devotional fervor to the point of bigotry or intolerance, so it was quite impossible to start an inquisition among them. But still there were compensations. The fungus wine of the Edems was potent though evil-tasting, and there were females of a sort if one was not too squeamish. Consequently, Mordjai and Iban both settled down to an ecclesiastic regimen, which after all was not so radically different from that of Muthulan or any other place on the planet of their birth. Such were the various adventures, and such was the final lot of this redoubtable pair in Sikranaj. But in Iban's tower of black gneiss, on that headland of the northern sea in Muthulan, the underlings of Mordjai waited for days, neither wishing to follow the high priest through the magic panel, nor daring to leave in disobedience of his orders. At length they were recalled by a special dispensation from the Hierophant, who had been chosen as Mordjai's temporary successor. but the result of the whole affair was highly regrettable from the standpoint of the hierarchy of Hyundai. It was universally believed that Iban had not only escaped by virtue of the powerful magic he had learned from Sothakwa, but had made away with Morjai into the bargain. As a consequence of this belief, the faith of Hyundai declined, and there was a widespread revival of the dark worship of Sothakwa throughout Musulan in the last century before the onset of the Great Ice Age.